So today's session will be followed by two main questions, and each question will be discuss a little bit around 20 minutes. And so I will start the first questions, and you can raise your hands anytime you want to interact. So Professor Herr, welcome again. So one question, as we also discussed some of the participants on the discussion access, is talking about identifying the economic clusters, or when we're talking about creating a new one in the country. However, if the country is not apparently in a certain product of market, does it necessarily need to be related to the either absolute or relative advantages, especially when considering to link to the external market when we're taking for the export? So, and because you mentioned also like unregulated markets push less developed countries in an international distribution of labor, which does not allow for catch up. So, and one of the participants was also mentioning the processing of local foods. So what are these considerations when we identify or create a new economic clusters? Thanks.
Okay, thank you for this question. First, let me explain. If a country accepts the logic of markets and follows absolute and comparative advantages, it is really pushed to a country from the global south. It is really pushed to labor-intensive, low capital-intensive types of production. This is simply how the market works, because the developing country has a comparative advantage in cheap labor, labor-intensive productions, and the market will push the country to this kind of productions. And this is fine. You can have some employment effects, but the country will remain on a low level of productivity and will not be able to catch up. So that means if a country only relies on comparative advantages or absolute advantages, it will not be able to catch up to follow the structural changes in the world economy, to establish new industries, etc., etc. This is why actually all experts in the field, let's say the heterodox experts, argue the country has to create new advantages. It has to really create new advantages, and this is not done by the market. You need to support the market by government intervention. So there are many examples. Let's just take the example from Taiwan with orchids, these flowers. Yeah, it's a very simple example. In Thailand and Taiwan, there was a crisis in the agricultural sector. Typical export product could not be sold any longer. So the government was thinking, what could we do? And they really developed out of nothing, so to speak, the production of orchids. And what did they do? They found that a research institute to find out how to grow orchids. They educated farmers. They gave credits to the farmers to build greenhouses. They gave credits so that the farmers could invest. The government started a global marketing campaign, etc. And this is a typical cluster policy. Different players play together, and it became a success. So this was an example, a simple example how a country really can create out of nothing a new industry. More difficult is, of course, the establishment of completely new industries, but this is also possible. Think about South Korea. South Korea did not have any car industry, and it established a car industry, and it has now a very successful, very competitive global car industry created out of nothing. So if South Korea would have followed the market, they would never have a car industry even until today.
Yes, that's great. That's great, Professor. Yeah, thanks. So anyone have questions? Now we're open for discussions. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
I'm just thinking about the statement coming from Professor that especially for the less developing economy, that there is a need to create a new advantages. So because if we rely on the logic of market, wherein for example, less developing economy like the Philippines, for example, that we are relying on cheap labor as our comparative advantage. We actually export human capital. Most of our skilled workers are going out abroad, but those who remains here are working in labor-intensive industry, like those who are working in export processing zones, in garments, in electronics, and those industry that are in low value-added activity. So I'm thinking what particular intervention that we can that the government or state should intervene in this kind of a scenario that we are being trapped and find it very difficult to catch up with the one that the new industrialized economy has been undertaken before. So it seems that we have been lost for a century, that we are not building enough to really industrialize ourselves. I'm really take the example you have mentioned about Taiwan, Thailand, South Korea, because in the 80s I remember that we have some kind of potential to build our own clothing brand, because during that time our garment sector was really robust, and we have easy market because we have been given a quota, but we did not upgrade those production that we just maintain as in a low level of production in terms of apparel manufacturing. So do you think that there's still some way that the Philippines or other less developing economy can still climb the ladder of development which the other nations have been doing for many years ago? Or what particular state intervention that we can still have at hand in this regard? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I think it's still possible to catch up, and I mean it's not so easy. You need heavy government interventions. You need good government policies, but I think it's possible. China is an example. I mean, whether we like it or not, but China is an example of catching up. And when we look at industrial policy, we can learn from China even today, yeah. And from the past, we can learn from Scandinavian countries. They did it in a more democratic way, or South Korea and the Asian tigers. Just to make the problem again clear, even if you have foreign direct investment, we've just finished a research project analyzing global value chains, and we found out the typical foreign investor will bring in some productivity to improve the quality of the product. It will improve even the technology to produce something. But as you have mentioned, Ramon, the foreign investor will not bring in technologies will really lead to higher value added tasks. It will not lead to higher value added productions. And why? It's clear a multinational company would be stupid, so to speak, to transfer core competences which create a lot of profits and value to other countries. So the market will not do that. So what we don't have in global value chains, for example, is this functional upgrading. So, but what can governments do? I think the most demanding point is to select good projects. This can be projects in global value chains to implement functional upgrading. It can be the establishment of completely new industries. But this is, of course, a very difficult process, and it should be done as rational as possible. And it should fit to the situation of the country. And let's say if several such projects are selected, then a few could be realized. And what you really need is you need a cluster policy. Cluster policy, that means you need the interaction of different policies. You need a private investor, why not? Sometimes it's also state-owned companies. Yeah, in many successful countries, also state-owned companies took over the role, but it can also be private investor. You need, what is very important, finance. You need really strong development banks in the country which provide long-term finance. You need, what is as important, you need qualification. You not only general qualification, you need very specific qualification on different levels, vocational education, university education. You have to bring in research institutes, cooperation with universities or research institutes. And you need, what is also very important, infrastructure investment, usually. In different ways, transportation, digital infrastructure, and so on. That means a successful approach needs a whole package of policies which in a coherent way establish new productions. The problem for the global south is, especially if they have implemented free trade, or if they have a lot of free trade agreements, they cannot use tariffs any longer. So that's a disadvantage. However, there are still, in my opinion, policy instruments available. The ones I mentioned are allowed, and also subsidies to a certain extent, if they go in the ecological direction or in regional development, are allowed. So to sum up to your question, you need really a coherent cluster policy. And what seems to be important, this cannot be done by a government bureaucrat alone. You need the interaction of different players. What are the key players? Of course, employers associations and trade unions and government are the key players, but you can integrate also research institutes, experts, etc. Let me give you the example from Germany. In Germany, we have very extensive, comprehensive industrial policy. We have, for example, the Fraunhofer Institute. This is an institute employing more than 20,000 people. This institute is doing nothing else than establish clusters together with industry, with companies, to implement new technology. So what you need is this package, and yeah, of course, trade unions can play an important role in such a package. Yeah.
Yes, very much, very excellent. Thank you so much. That's exactly the complexity. Industrial clusters often consist of a package. This comprehensiveness, I think, need to be addressed very much. Yes, please, Indira.
Just a very short follow-up question, Pramon, and to what you said earlier, Hansjörg. You said if you accept that the market logic, then you will find where you can create some sort of a niche, right? And then the example of Taiwan mentioning the orchids. But now, can we put in the equation the environmental crisis? So we just don't want to create goods for the sake of creating goods and keeping the market going, but really, how do we actually incorporate this environmental dimension into the cluster policy? So what would be the considerations of not just inventing, like, let's say, an orchids industry, but really infrastructure that meets the basic needs of humanity within the boundaries of the planet?
Yeah, I think the very important question. I think industrial policy became very fashionable again. Also in Germany and the United States and in the global South anyway. And I think there are two explanations why I think we will enter a new phase of very, very, very intensive industrial policy all over the world. Why is this the case? First, China. China uses heavy industrial policy in a very successful way. Now, in Western countries, so to say, it's argued if China is doing this in such a successful way, we have also to do it. More important is what you, Adlira, have mentioned, the ecological crisis. As we all know, we have this fundamental market failure, not only reproducing underdevelopment, but even worse, probably, that technological, the logic and the way of technology development, which is driven by the market, leads to catastrophic ecological development. Why? I think economists are quite clear about that. The price system, the incentive system of capitalism gives systematically wrong signals. So that means the technological development is running systematically in the wrong direction. It does not take into account the environment. So that means you need heavy government interventions, industrial policy interventions to solve the ecological crisis. So that I think the very, very important point, any kind of cluster policy, any kind of industrial intervention must take into account the ecological crisis. And I mean, it's always also a political decision which technology develops and which technology is used. And this has to be decided politically to have environmental friendly technology. So that means industrial policy anyway has to be used to solve the ecological crisis. And it has to be integrated in all activities of the state.
Yes, thanks. Please, Susanne.
Hello. Yeah, thank you for the ecological question. That was one I had overall, or I've been having since I've started reading the papers and listening to the online lectures. Because I mean, I don't think that we want, or do we, or maybe more as a question, do we want that all the countries develop as the developed countries? I mean, like the global north. I mean, that cannot be our goal. First of all, because ecological, that wouldn't work. And it's, I mean, who says that the way how the global north lives is the best, how people could and should live? Yeah. So the question is how they can establish something or develop in a way that is, good for them, for the people who live there, for the environment. And so that takes more into concern, the specific situations they have, and not just copying what other countries already do? I mean, that's something that has been on my mind as one thought. And specific, I wanted to ask two things. I'm on my way to Ethiopia, and they have started, or they have already a garment business, and that one should develop in a good way, but it's already there. What can you do if it's already there? How can you influence that? Not only some companies make a lot of money, but that also the working conditions develop, that payment increases. I think it seems easier when you're at the beginning and you sit there and have an idea and you develop it together, but they have already, there has already been a beginning, and I'm not so sure if it's so good. And one very concrete, if I understood, is like the trade union, which is responsible for the garment industry. They are sent from the government. They're not a free trade union. So if they are part of the cluster, I mean, will they do their job? That was it for now. Thank you.
Thank you for this good but also difficult questions. To your first question is, should the global South copy the global North? Probably not. It should try to find own technological solutions. However, I expect that I expect and I fear that countries in the global South want to follow the global North, and that means it might be very difficult to tell them, we drive big cars in the global North, but you in the global South, you don't get cars or so. There may be some room to create alternative consumption patterns, etc. But I think what should be done is that the global North changes. That the global North changes. You know, we have now elections in Germany, and then many times it's argued by especially conservatives, we just have 2.5% of CO2 emissions. But when we do something, what's that? It's useless. But I think the global North has to create a role model. It has to show that a different type of production and consumption production pattern is possible. Of course, Susanna, I agree fully. If it is possible to create alternative development logics in the global South, it's fine. But I think we have to start in the North first. And then we can show how it works. But both should be done. With a garment industry in Ethiopia, that's a difficult question. I remember I joined in a very intensive debate in Vietnam about the development of the garment industry. And there was a debate to climb up the value chain. That means climbing up the value chain means to create brands, famous brands. Then you can make a lot of money. But the Vietnamese experts argued this is extremely difficult for Vietnam to create a brand which can compete with the fashion brands we have in the West. And they thought in the case of Vietnam it was maybe more useful to go downwards in the global value chains to produce cotton and such things. But this is maybe a good example, this garment industry. Probably it would be easier to establish a completely new sector, something completely new, because the garment industry is so established and it is so difficult to really realize productions with high value added. Of course, what you can do, you as Ethiopia, to serve the domestic market and such things. Still, you can do a lot of things, but the garment industry, it's very difficult to upgrade for countries. But still, yes, they can try. But they also should look what we have discussed, whether there are other opportunities in which it is easier probably to create more value, to enter more value-adding productions.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Herr. It's always nice to have your class always with concrete examples. And regarding to the question, and I really like the question of Susanna mentioned about this copying from the global south to the north. I remember there was like a delegation from Europe went to China in 1990s. And then they saw we are the kingdom of bicycle, bike countries. Everyone have a bicycle, and everyone was saying that's such a great thing that to use this as a main transportation for workers. However, I remember Deng Xiaoping at the moment, the president, he said, okay, now you don't want us to have a very mindset of this kind of imperialistic mindset. So now we have cars, and now all the cities in China are polluted and chaotic with the traffic jams. And I think that's true. And Professor Herr also said, I think maybe the changes can be coming from the global north, because I remember in our previous course with the professor also emphasized calling about this imperial mode of living, the consumption cultures. Somehow, unfortunately, global south, we are following many kind of these patterns, and which is copying from the north. So maybe that could be one solution. So let's move to the second questions, which is also very important, which we have already talked a little bit. Indeed, I also asked about the environmental upgrading and social upgrading. So in our XF discussions, participants also mentioning that the participation of trade unions, labor groups, and other social movements should participate to ensure all these industrial and cluster policies should incorporate with the environment and the social upgradings. So what are the incentives that think for the government to take these progressive forces to ensure this environment and social upgradings? And as you mentioned, Professor, you mentioned about these German institutions who are exclusively focused on the cluster policies. Can you give some examples? Like, are they also involved with trade unions or other groups in Germany, or there's other good examples?
I thank you also for this very, very important question. I think trade unions should be involved in industrial policy formulation. But it's pretty clear in many countries, employers have no interest, government has no interest to include the trade unions. But even in such cases, I think it's very, very important that trade unions develop ideas how industrial policy should look like. And I think this is possible at different levels. It can start on a firm level, so that trade unions can make proposals how to restructure, how to develop a firm, maybe in ecological production and better technology qualification. Then on sectoral level, and then of course on national level, it depends of course a bit on the capacity of the trade union. And I think that's very, very important. Even if trade unions are not integrated, they can develop ideas and can take part in the debate and hope that they are integrated. I think there's one example I would like to give you. This is this fading out the coal production in Germany. So we had a kind of round table. I don't know whether you all know this. The Germans definitely know this. We had this round table to the coal commission to fade out the coal production for energy production, electricity, etc. And I looked a little bit at this table. There were 24 persons with voting right, and that was really reflecting a kind of the society as a whole. So we had, for example, the president of the trade union, which is responsible for the coal sector. We had from DGB people, we had Greenpeace, we had, of course, employers associations, we have government, etc. And this was established in 2018, and 1 year later they gave a proposal that in 2038, that would be the latest date that we have energy production, electricity production by coal. This is heavily criticized. Some argue it is too late, etc. But I think that that's a kind of model how industrial policy could look like. I mean, there are 750,000 jobs involved. That's for Germany a lot, 750,000 jobs, which have to be restructured. Of course, a lot of new jobs will be created. A lot of old jobs will disappear. The government took over this proposal 1 year later. And I think this is a huge industrial policy project. And a lot of money is spent. And of course, we don't know how successful the restructuring of this coal industry will be, how many jobs will be able to be saved, etc. But this is an example how you could say on a macro level, certain industrial policy projects can be implemented.
Thank you very much. So yes, we have a question from Brett. Brett, we have very few participants. So would you like to raise your question by yourself, or would you like me to read your questions? Okay then. So then I will read for Brett. So Brett is from Philippines, and he will ask the questions. Professor, do you think the institutionalizing like ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance, or sustainable investment will help or become a big factor in mitigating the ecological damage brought by the economic development and business? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a little bit the same topic we had already discussed. I think in all industrial policies, the ecological dimension has to be integrated. I think that seems to be of key importance. That the ecological crisis only can be solved if the technology and also the structure of consumption and production changes. I think there are at least the experts, and I agree with that. There are two policies, or maybe three policies necessary. First, you have to change the price system. You have to give the true costs. That means energy will become much more expensive. So this is the first dimension. The second dimension is what seems to me important for trade unions, even if in a long term a kind of zero growth economy may be a vision. I think for this restructuring for the next decades, really a kind of New Deal is needed, a huge investment program to restructure the economy. And this is, of course, good news for trade unions because it creates jobs. So I think that's an important dimension. Huge investment is needed to restructure the economy. And the third important point is this restructuring will lead to social disturbances. The old qualifications may be worthless, and also if energy becomes very, very expensive, it has distributional consequences. So I think also redistribution policy and social policy has to be combined. So I think this has to be brought together, these three dimensions, to have a kind of social ecological transformation, which also does not lead to mass unemployment.
Thank you very much. Yes, Philip, please.
Okay, sure. My concern when the prof suggests that we should follow the North and then giving the example of China and South Korea. Okay, to start with, the South Korea are making their own car. Is it the car that they are manufacturing originated in South Korea, or is the car which are already being made like Mercedes-Benz, Toyota, and so on, and taking advantage of South Korea's skilled cheap labor? Again, when we look how China became so strong today, is because of its trade policy with America, because in America, the workers had more power, had more rights, and then the cooperation started to flow into China, because in China, workers are exploited, and then also taxes are very low, which means that the poor of the poorest have to pay the price. And then that's how many companies left America and goes to China. And then also, if we are, industrialization and culture, they come together. So meaning that, and then as you start from, I don't even think it's fair to say industrialization started from the North, because they stole ideas from all over the world and they made it theirs, and then together, and then they controlled that culture, so to favor their interests. So everything, whatever, where there's industrialization or so-called development, it is attached with the way people in the US, or not everyone in the US, but the administration in the US would like us to do. And then, okay, if we look, the leaders who have attempted to do something which does not agree with America. For an example, in Africa, we got Thomas Sankara. Not to say I agree with him at all, but he was one of the people who pushed that Burkina Faso must have its own, must produce its own, and then people must consume locally. And then because the North was not happy about it, what they did, they killed him. And then, there's many examples. And then he was doing the good. He was, from the bottom of his heart. And then it shows the examples that if he lived, that idea, if it was encouraged, it would have developed. And then they killed him. And then we go to look in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, they killed him. And then because what he was doing didn't agree with the North. And then again, Gaddafi, they killed him. And then so on and so on and so on. There's so many examples that we can give. And I'm not saying China is bad. There's something good in China. And then also, you have to look at the child policy in China, which in fact favored these companies which came, because workers are paid less, and because they didn't have many big families to look after. So the child policy did favor the European companies which are exploiting workers in China. I mean, if you look in South Africa, a worker is supporting, 20 dependents. So do you think if workers in South Africa, they're paid like workers in China? We've got example of Marikana where 34 mine workers were gunned down for demanding 12,000 pay a month. And then, we've got fact, one mine worker is supporting how many work? Has got maybe 24 dependents and so on. So, I think there's something good in China that we can use elsewhere. There's something good in Africa and so on. There's something good in Europe. If we look in the history, we have got Workers' Day today in the whole world, which started in America and so on. So, sorry, that's what I can say. I'm sure you had me.
Philip, where are you based? Can we know?
South Africa.
South Africa. Thank you very much for the very difficult questions. And I think we need another day to have a whole day workshop. Yes, but let's give some comments from Professor here. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. That were very, very complex questions, and let me try to answer it in the following way. I think what should be clear for us, and also for trade unions, you have to combine economic and social upgrading, and economic upgrading involves industrial policy. Otherwise, you don't catch up. But you have to combine economic and social upgrading. And it's obvious without economic upgrading, social upgrading is not possible. To be precise, social upgrading, democratic rights, certain redistribution is possible, but really an increase in of the living standard of the majority of population, which in many countries of the global south still is needed, is only possible if you increase productivity. On the other hand, if social upgrading does not automatically follow economic upgrading. And let me come to China. I think it's clear China managed to increase productivity substantially. And my impression is when you look at Chinese development, all groups in society benefited, but to a different extent. So when we look at World Bank data, reduction in poverty, then China is a major contributor to the reduction in poverty. So very successful when you look at that. But on the other hand, we know no free trade unions and exploding inequality. And in my opinion, this can become dangerous for China. It can create political problems. It may destroy the coherence of society. So I think these dimensions are missing for a really very, very successful development. Let me add to the population. That's an important point. When you compare, for example, India with China, India also had relatively good GDP growth rates, but GDP per capita did not increase much. Why? Population growth. And I think that when we look at the world population growth, I just did it a few days ago, Asia is shrinking, Europe is slightly shrinking, Latin America is stagnating. The only area is Africa with a very strong population growth. And it expected that in 30, 40 years, probably also this population growth will become smaller. But I agree with you. If population growth is too high, you may produce overpopulation, which is not, the capitalist system does not lead automatically to full employment, and you may create a population which does not find good jobs. I know that it's a very, very difficult debate about population growth, but I think if in South Africa, for example, it would be possible to implement welfare state structures, etc., I think then population growth would also go down, also in whole Africa.
Yes, thanks very much. Let me also input one thing. Apart from the cause of democratic issues and human rights regarding to that one-child policy that she implemented in the 1970s, now we are enter another problems. Now we have opened, and now the debate in China is also saying we liberalize all the policy, birth policies. However, now the problem is nobody wants to give more babies. As they started to gradually doing second baby, third baby, but the research have been found also does not have much changes. So that demographic dividend, it was used as one of maybe one part of the industrial policy. Maybe I'm right, and but now it's another aspect looking at that. No, yeah, we're also following with this kind of going down with the birth rate. Yes, please, Gifford, please.
Okay, thank you. I have a comment and a question. So Philip mentioned Korea, and the Hyundai Automotive Group in Korea is the fourth biggest producer in the world. And from the beginning, when they made their Pony car in the 1970s, they produced their own industry. So that's a remarkable success story of an auto industry that started from the ground up against, all the advice of the World Bank and everyone else told them not to do it. Bringing it back to auto, I do have a question about the possible negative models of clusters. So I'm from the US, and here in the US, Detroit was one of the original clusters of automobile production, especially when Henry Ford had his vertically integrated plant, the River Rouge plant, where all the raw materials came in one side and Model A's rolled out the other. And that really changed with Toyota's innovations half a century later. And I think Toyota was able to create this system of outsourcing as well as just in time and inventoryless and things like that. But in the United States, the auto cluster kind of exploded, and it still is a cluster, but it went to the US South, where there were really, really weak laws about unions that even discouraged unions. And then eventually with NAFTA in '94, and with all the regulatory changes, now there's a cluster in North America that goes from central Mexico through the US to Canada. But it kind of races to the bottom, and it's always looking for the lowest wages, even within a really broad regional cluster. Now, this is a broad question too. How could, short of just kind of linkages between countries, how with all these clusters somehow linked with supply chains across the world, what are some possibilities of building stronger connections between workers? Because I see in a lot of ways, if you have a regional cluster that's divided by border, it pits workers from one country against another. How do we combat that? How do we fight back? I know that's a really, really big question, but I think that's something really important, because I think, of course, capitalists are going to look for the lowest wages, and like a cluster in auto is really a lot of capital intensive fixed investments. They're not going to pull up and move much, but they do move to some extent. I know that's a big question, but could you answer some parts of that?
Thank you for this very important question. Two answers. First, an important element of cluster policy should be sectoral wage bargaining. I think that's very, very important, if possible nationwide. Yeah, sectoral wage bargaining, because companies should not compete with wages. They should compete with technology and good organization. that they should not compete with wages, so that at least within one country, sectoral wage bargaining, giving the same wage costs for all companies, that's an important element of cluster policy. And I think it's very, very important to understand that this is really pushing productivity, sectoral wage bargaining. Why should trade unions subsidize companies which are badly managed and with poor technology in a country? Yeah, this should not happen. It can happen for a certain period of time to give the company time to adjust, but then I think we would have really this sectoral wage bargaining. It's one element of industrial policy because it creates pressure for companies to adjust. For the international dimensions, that's a more difficult question. First, I would support, Gifford, your argument that South Korea really established out of nothing, so to say, with comprehensive industrial policy, car industry. And however, at that time, they could use tariffs. They could use tariffs to protect the infant industry, as it is called. And I think when we look at development of the global South, we should also create a situation in which tariffs can be used again. I'm a great fan of the American economist Danny Roderick, and he argued probably one should go back to a globalization model of the 1960s, so to speak, to allow some protection, some tariffs for infant industry, and give room for industrial policy. And that would, in my opinion, should also include structural adjustments of industries in the developed world, so that if the competitiveness of an industry suddenly changes, there should be some protection possible. In the old regulations, with even with WTO regulations, such protections are possible. What is really bad are these free trade agreements or these bilateral investment and trade agreements, because they take away a lot of interventions which could smooth structural change, etc. Yeah, so far to this difficult question. Yeah.
Yes. So we still have a few minutes. If anyone want to raise up any not big difficult question. Anyone?
If I may just follow up on the environmental question, Hansjörg, one of the debates has been also about shortening the global supply chains. So I just wonder, how do all these things come together? You know, the environmental concern related to that shortening of global supply chains, the fact that the industrial policy is coming back forcefully in the agenda. So how do all these variables play, perhaps also as a way of closing up the workshop? What would be your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you, Adlira. Yes, shortening supply chains, that's an or reducing global trade is an important policy. And there are really very, very good economic arguments. I think a key policy in that area should be to increase transportation costs substantially. It's a scandal how cheap air freight is, or also the big ships, yeah, how dirty they are. If you really create a price system, internalize, so to say, the external costs, ecological costs in transportation costs, then transportation will become substantially more expensive. And then this will reduce international trade and global supply chains. And I think this is welfare increasing. Even the conservative economists would have to agree to that. This is welfare increasing if you internalize the external ecological costs. And it is really at the same time increasing a little bit the protection for the countries. It leads to a certain protection. That means increasing transportation costs, in my opinion, should be a key policy also to reduce global trade, to create more regional production networks, etc. And this should be supported by industrial policy explicitly, but we can use the price system and make transportation more expensive. And we should not be afraid if we have a certain deglobalization that we have unemployment. That's a wrong idea. Globalization is not creating jobs. Look at the 50s and 60s, we had much more job creation and no globalization. So between international trade, intensity of international trade and jobs, there's no relationship. So we could have a certain deglobalization, more regional production without destroying jobs overall.
Great. Yes. Gifford, do you want to read that question or? Yeah. Oh, it's already been answered. Yeah, I think it's Professor already answered. Yes, what a very great debate and a very good discussion, everyone, today. Thanks so much for Professor Herr. And just to remind, on this Thursday, we also have the micromanagement of industrial policy with Professor Herr. So at the same time, and please reminded you, like tomorrow, we also have the workshop on investment and trade agreement rules. So thanks everyone, and thanks Professor again.